entrepreneurs of the world. My name is Glenn Turansky. I am a member of the advisory board here at One Business World, our host platform for leading entrepreneurs of the world, which features entrepreneurs, founders, and business leaders presenting on cutting-edge topics and the latest in industry developments. Our goal is to provide the global business and entrepreneurial communities with the window into the minds of those shaping the future of the world. Today, we're very pleased to welcome back leading biomedical engineer, professor, and educator, author, and serial entrepreneur, Dr. Eric Ledet. Dr. Ledet is a biomedical engineer with 25 years of award-winning translational research experience, 20 years of consulting for the medical device industry, and 10 years experience as a serial entrepreneur in the medical device sector. Eric is also an award-winning educator who has developed curricula and taught classes on design, product development, and technology transfer. He has served on the medical advisory boards of multiple medical device companies, and he has served as a grant reviewer on 7 SBIR study sections for NIH and NIDILRR. Dr. Ledet is the Chief Science Officer and co-founder of ReVivo Medical Incorporated. He is also a Vice President of Research and Development and Director of the Health Innovation Incubator at the Center for Disability Services in Albany, New York. Dr. Ledet is also an Adjunct Professor in Orthopaedic Surgery at the Albany Medical College. Prior to his current role, he was Professor in Biomedical Engineering at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute and a research scientist in the Rehabilitation R&D Service at the Stratton VA Medical Center. Dr. Ledet is also co-founder of IO Surgical, inSense Medical, and Proactive Innovations. Eric, it's a pleasure to be back with you again. You've done some tremendous appearances here for us already and some great content. We look forward to hearing about your topic today, which is writing a winning SBIR proposal to NIH. So let me hand it off and I'll be back with you on the back end, okay?
Thank you very much, Glenn. I appreciate the introduction, and it's great to be back with you guys again. So what I'm going to do, as you said, is I'm going to talk a little bit today about writing a winning SBIR proposal, that Small Business Innovative Research proposal, to the National Institutes of Health. And as Glenn said during the introduction, I have somewhat of a diverse background, both in academics and working as a consultant for industry. And in my latest role, I run a incubator for startups in the medical devices space. And I'm going to talk about SBIR grants today, talk about what those are and what advantages they have for a startup company. I've been lucky enough to win 2 different SBIR grants myself as principal investigator. I've had many that got rejected. I learned a lot from those, but where I learned the most was in being a reviewer. Because in being a reviewer, I got to see the difference between a good SBIR grant and some real bad SBIR grants. And so I can share some of my experiences with you today in hopes that it helps you to prepare a winning SBIR grant. So just as a quick overview, talk a little bit about non-dilutive funding opportunities, of which SBIR and STTR grants fall into that category. Talk a little bit about the advantages of these types of proposals and grants, and also some of the disadvantages, why these might not be the best utilization of a startup's time and energy. Talk a little bit about the process of what to do before writing the proposal, and then specifically going into how to prepare a winning proposal and looking at the specific subtopics or subsections of the proposal that a reviewer will be assessing. And those include the impact, the significance, the innovation, the approach, the information on the investigators themselves, the environment, and also some budgetary concerns. So we'll go through some of those, each of those in some detail to help advise on how to do a winning proposal. So first, as a startup company, it's going out and fundraising, especially some early stage funding, some seed funding, can be challenging. That can be a big hurdle for a startup. And one of the things that's great about some of these different funding mechanisms is that they're non-dilutive. And so the company doesn't need to actually give up any equity or anything in order to get these funds. There are oftentimes state or regional funds that are available. Sometimes business plan competitions fall into this category. Oftentimes universities and local incubators or accelerators sponsor these, and they're a good way for a startup to get out, get some feedback, and potentially get some funding in. There are also state level business development programs. Where I am in the state of New York, we have the Empire State Development Program, which offers both advice as well as grant and funding opportunities. And then we have NISTAR, the New York State Office of Science, Technology, and Academic Research, which has programs and funding for startups as well. So if you're outside of New York State, there's likely comparable programs that are available, and I encourage every startup to go out and see what they can find, with this. The NSF in particular, the National Science Foundation, has the I-Corps program. These are also grants that are specifically targeted to startups. They specifically focus on customer discovery. So typically if someone in academics has a technology that they've developed and are wondering whether this is something that should be commercialized, the I-Corps program helps to educate would-be entrepreneurs on how to go out and do that, and also then to actually find customers and end users and use that to drive decisions about the business. These are great. They're non-dilutive funding from the federal government, but it is fairly restricted to customer discovery efforts. And then that brings us to the SBIR and STTR funding programs, which are offered through the federal government. I'm going to specifically talk about NIH, but these are offered through other agencies through the federal government, including NSF has a SBIR program, DoD. Not every institute within these larger organizations offers SBIRs and STTRs, but many of them do. And of course, this is non-dilutive funding. We'll talk a little bit more in a second about what the different options are for the grants, but there are what are typically called phase 1, phase 2, and phase 2B grants, and they have different funding amounts associated with them, with a phase 1 being more like a seed round, phase 2 like a series A, and phase 2B being more like a series B round. And of course, getting these, not only is there money that comes along with it, but great recognition as well. So let's talk a little bit about the SBIR and STTR funding, again, with a focus on NIH. So SBIR is Small Business Innovative Research, and this is funds that are earmarked through the federal government in the United States to support startups and small businesses. I think the key word in there is innovative. It's really, these funds are available to stimulate high-tech innovation, to help facilitate innovation that might not happen, that might not become public and benefit the public good in the United States without some funding, some support from the federal government. So specifically, the mission is to enable small businesses to explore their technological potential and provide the incentive to profit from its commercialization. So one of the things that's important about an SBIR is that the principal investigator, the lead person on the grant, must be working at least 50% for the startup company. And that's important if, again, if this comes out of academics, or maybe this is a spinoff from a larger organization or something like that. The PI, then this must actually be certified that the PI is working 50% for the startup. In contrast to that, but part of the same program, is the STTR, Small Business Technology Transfer grants. And these generally support tech transfer out of universities. And they stimulate partnerships between universities and startups. So again, these would typically be applicable for technology that's being spun out of a university by a faculty member, by a student, by a staff member, and going into the startup world. And again, the mission here to stimulate and foster scientific and technological innovation through cooperative research and development carried out between small businesses and research institutions. And in this case, the PI, the principal investigator, can either be working for the company or for the university. And so there's a couple of restrictions on both sides of this. Administratively, we'll talk more about those in a minute. But these are the two different major funding mechanisms, SBIRs and STTRs. So what are the advantages of these types of grants, of an SBIR or an STTR? Well, the first thing is that this is non-dilutive funding, right, which is very obvious. So effectively, it's free money. It doesn't cost the startup anything, no equity. It's not an investment. It is a grant from the federal government. So there is some accountability that the startup has to the federal government as far as reporting and things like that, but there's no equity that's relinquished. And so this is truly just a grant that can go right into the coffers or the checking account of the startup company. So this is obviously the huge advantage. Along with that is also the prestige that comes along with this. These are very competitive programs. There's a very small percentage of awards that are actually funded. It ranges from institute to institute and grant mechanism to grant mechanism, but generally fewer than 10% of these proposals are getting funded. So these are very competitive, and winning one of these is very prestigious. The technology that's included in the grant proposal is vetted by a study section, a panel of experts, and those are people who decide whether this has any value or not. So again, for a startup company, using the fact that they have won an SBIR can be very strong for marketing and promotion, and I strongly recommend a startup gets an SBIR to do a press release and to make a big deal out of it, because it is a big deal. There's also some value, some advantage of going through the process for, especially an early stage startup. Even if the grant ends up not being funded, going through the process of submitting a proposal forces a startup to plan all the way from concept to commercialization, because that's what's required with these proposals. And so really thinking through every stage of concept all the way through into an exit for that company can be very valuable and can be very powerful, not only for the grant proposal, but also setting up, any other future fundraising efforts. Going through the process of putting together a proposal helps to define development process and milestones. Generally, this has to be done in great detail for the proposal, and so it really helps to lay out the path and the roadmap for the company. And of course, the grant narrative effectively is a business plan and a pitch deck all wrapped up into one. And so that can be used to help refine the pitch deck and the business plan for the startup. It's also really good, again, whether the grant is funded or not, getting feedback from the study section. I'll talk more about this in a couple of minutes, but effectively a summary statement, which is the review, comes back from the study section, and it will have the opinions of the reviewers, and the reviewers will express what they think are strengths and express what they think are weaknesses. And so this feedback can be used for the company to better understand exactly what they're doing right and what maybe needs some refinement. And this can help, again, to update the pitch deck and the business plan to make things even more attractive for future fundraising. This is typically what, well, at least pre-COVID, this is what a study section looked like. I swear that I've actually sat in this room myself, but typically about 30 people or so sitting around a table and discussing the different proposals as they come up, offering opinions, and ultimately providing scores. So there's typically a lot of effort that goes into this, and these proposals are vetted in great detail. So, and of course, one of the other advantages, especially starting with a phase 1 proposal, and I'll talk more about what that means in a second, is that if a small company wins and completes a phase 1, they can lead to a phase 2 grant and be a real stepping stone or launch pad for future funding to come in as well. So a number of different advantages in addition to the obvious one, which is non-dilutive funding here. I would submit that there are also some disadvantages, or at least some reasons to put some thought into whether an SBIR or STTR is the right path to go. It does take significant time and effort to prepare a competitive proposal. And it's, because time is money, a startup will have to make the decision on, is this the best utilization of the effort and the time of the startup? Is it really going to be worth it to put the effort in order to get a proposal and see whether it can get funded? Also, the timing on the review cycles may be a disadvantage. At NIH, and this may change, from year to year, so I would encourage any startup to go and look, make sure that they get the details. But typically, there are only 3 cycles per year, meaning that there's only 3 opportunities to submit a proposal in any given year. And this is pulled right off of the NIH's site. But you can see here that those deadlines for submission are September 5th, January 5th, and April 5th of each year. And so by missing one of these submission dates, it means going back, the next 4 months or so until the next cycle comes available. And, the turnaround time can also be very significant. There are very few proposals that are funded in the first round. What's much more typical is that a proposal is submitted, comments come back in that summary statement from the reviewers. The investigative team will address those issues, try to revise the proposal, and resubmit it. So that means that there's 2 cycles and time between, which means that, for example, if a proposal were submitted on September 5th of a certain year, it would get reviewed in October or November of that year. It would actually then go to what's called the advisory council, which means that they would review it and see whether the score was sufficient to get funding or not. That would happen in January or February. And if it was not selected for funding in the first round, which is typical, and again, there are very few that are funded in the first round, that means that the next deadline, which would be available for revision to be submitted, would be the April deadline. And the review timeline for April is then it would get reviewed by the study section in June or July. It would get board or advisory council review in August. And if it's funded, that funding becomes available sometime in September to December. And so in fact, that's an entire year from the time that that first proposal was submitted until funding actually was secured in the following year. So that could be a year plus turnaround time. So that can be a disadvantage to this type of proposal. It's up to the startup company to decide whether that timing is sufficient and whether this is important enough. Total funding can be limited for a phase 1 proposal, depending on the institute and the agency, around 100,000 to 250,000. That varies from institute to institute. Phase 2 funding can be greater. I'll talk more about that in a second. And phase 2B as well. But for a year, waiting a year, and for all the time and effort put in, the company would have to decide, is it going to be worth it, to do this? But it is free money, and so there may be a lot of value in actually taking the time, being patient, and trying to get the SBIR. So, all right, if you decide to prepare a proposal, what are the next steps? So I submit that it's actually very important to do a couple of things before writing the proposal. And based on my experience as a principal investigator and an author of these grants, I suggest that a startup company that has never applied for an SBIR before start 10 weeks before the due date. And I'll talk about why 10 weeks specifically I think is very important. There are guidelines. Typically, if I do a search, for the words SBIR parent announcement, that will pull down the current guidelines for which institutes are providing funding. Again, what the timelines are, whether there's specific programs that are in place. Again, whether the funding limits have changed. That will all be in the SBIR parent announcement. These do change every couple of years. So just because you have one from a year or two ago doesn't mean that one is still current today. Then I would go and I would make sure to download the forms and the templates. There's a document called the SF424, which is essentially a step-by-step guide that walks investigators through literally how to fill in every box and complete every section. This particular document has a PDF. Excuse me, as a PDF is a couple hundred pages long. That's the downside to it. The upside to it is that it is very detailed and answers a lot of questions on how to actually do this. So after looking at the parent announcement, looking at the SF424 or whatever might be the appropriate format, I think at this point, what is absolutely critical is to identify the best fit study section. Let me explain what I mean by this. Within NIH, for example, there are several different institutes. There's an Allergy Institute, there's Arthritis Institute, there's Cancer Institute, there's a whole bunch of different institutes. Within each of those institutes, they have different study sections, and the study sections are specific to particular domains of medicine or health. And a proposal will get sent to the appropriate study section for review. Identifying the best study section for a particular proposal by the investigators is absolutely key. And I think the way to do that is to look at the specific problem domains that are listed, to look at the past members. There will be rosters from past meetings of the study section, and it will show what their backgrounds, their titles, and their expertise is. And to look at the titles of grants that were previously funded by the different study sections. All right, so for example, here is, again, this is just a screenshot from NIH, and it's showing the different study sections. And here we have the innovative immunology research, the microbial vaccine development research, anti-infectives. The next one is too long to read, drug discovery and development, biomaterials, et cetera, et cetera. So these are all different study sections. And there's two other pieces of important information that are here. There's a link on the left side over here that takes, when you click on that link, it takes you to the specific topics and a more detailed description of what those study sections do. And over on the right is a link to information, contact information for the scientific review officer, or SRO. And I'm going to talk about the SRO a little bit more in a minute. So let's say we click on a particular study section. I clicked on NIAMS, which is National Institute of Arthritis, Musculoskeletal and Skin Disorders. And it lists the specific topics that these study sections, that this study section reviews, related to orthopedic surgery, related to oral and dental diseases, inflammation of the skin, and rehabilitative strategies. So we can look at this and I can say, oh, okay, the topic for my company, the topic for my technology, the topic for my proposal falls underneath the topics for this particular study section. This is a good match for me, or I'm not sure if this is a good match, I should continue looking. I think identifying and contacting the scientific review officer, the SRO, can be really important and very helpful. The SROs are trained to work with startups. They're used to working with small companies, used to working with investigators who have probably never submitted an SBIR or may never even have prepared and submitted any type of grant proposal at all. And the SROs can also help a startup, an investigator, to determine whether their study section is the correct study section for a particular proposal or a particular topic. So reaching out to the SROs, I think, is very important and very helpful. All right, so after going through all that and identifying the study section, then I would say you make the commitment to putting the proposal in and registering. Now, this registration process is not trivial. And in fact, this part alone can take several weeks. So assuming that a startup already has a tax ID number, which if it's incorporated in the United States, it should, then going out and getting a Dun & Bradstreet DUNS number is very important. And that's critical to every step, every future step of registering a small company starts with that DUNS number. That process of getting the DUNS number from Dun & Bradstreet can take several weeks, and it just requires a bunch of information about the incorporation of the company. Then beyond that, as you can see in the screenshot from the bottom of my notes in the top here, is the system for award management. That's the electronic system that every small company has to register with if they're going to do business with the federal government in the United States. ERA Commons is a way to submit and track the grant. It's the way that reports will be uploaded to the NIH after the grant is awarded. It's a way information will be disseminated from NIH and the reviewers back to the company. So registering and creating an entity on ERA Commons is critical as well. The grants itself will be submitted through grants.gov. And information, those programs, details, the forms and everything will be available through grants.gov as well. And then specifically for the SBIR, to be eligible, you have to go through a process. A small company has to demonstrate that they actually meet the eligibility criteria for SBIR and STTR programs. So NIH suggests that this takes at least 6 weeks. In my experience, that's 6 weeks if it's done exactly in the correct order and if you don't make any mistakes along the way. I would definitely leave more like 10 weeks because some of these things need to be done before others. And if you start in the wrong place, that can be a challenge. Definitely the place to start is with that DUNS number and getting that registration completed. Again, the SROs, the scientific review officers, can help with this process, make sure that a startup doesn't miss any of the steps here. And although this is just some, I would say, sort of silly administrative work, it's very frustrating to spend all the effort and time putting a grant proposal together and then realizing that you don't have a particular registration and you won't be able to submit it. So I would definitely start this first. Okay, within these programs, there are different funding mechanisms. SBIRs versus STTRs, right? We talked about this a little bit before, and this is generally dictated, choosing between an SBIR and STTR is generally dictated by who is going to lead the efforts. Is it someone working for the company primarily? Is it someone working for the university? Where is most of the work going to be done? If for an SBIR, at least 2/3 of the work has to be done by the company and only 1/3 can be subcontracted out to another entity. However, for an STTR, the expectation is that most of the work will actually be done in a university and that there will be a partnership with a startup company. So depending on the answers to those questions, that would dictate SBIR versus STTR. And then within these two programs, depending on the agency, there may or may not be a phase 1 opportunity, a phase 2 opportunity, what's called a fast track, or what's called a direct to phase 2. So let's talk about these a little bit. So a phase 1 is a smaller grant with respect to the amount of funding and the amount of time. The scope of a phase 1 is really to establish feasibility. So it's basically seed money. It's to determine whether a particular technology is feasible, whether it can work, and whether it is going to meet the needs for product development. The funding cap, again, it varies a little bit from agency to agency, but let's say around $250,000. And the duration is typically 6 to 12 months. So these are very quick turnaround time. And again, the scope is really just establishing feasibility. Phase 2 is really to then build on that once feasibility has been established and to actually develop the product. So phase 2 requires product development. Funding cap is around $2 million, again, plus or minus depending on the institute, and the duration is up to 2 years. And importantly, with a phase 2 proposal, not required in phase 1, but required in phase 2, is a commercialization plan. How is this actually going to become a product? How is it going to be commercialized? What is the business plan associated with this? Those things can be included in a phase 1 proposal, but it's not required. In a phase 2 proposal, it is required. Then a phase 2B is really intended to fund clinical translation. So once a product has been developed, how to actually get it through to where it can be rolled out and implemented clinically. There are a couple of expectations with this. So this is what NIH generally describes as helping a product get through the valley of death, which is typically what translation is referred to. And one of the requirements here is that external investor funds are generally required in order to secure this money from NIH. So this is typically a combination of investors and the phase 2B funds. So a fast track is also an option. A fast track is a single proposal that combines all the elements of a phase 1 and a phase 2. And so there have to be phase 1 feasibility milestones, and an approach, meaning the methods that will be used, as well as all the requirements for phase 2, including a commercialization plan. So it's ambitious, but there is an opportunity for specific types of products and for perhaps mature companies that know what to expect from phase 1, from feasibility evaluation, and then how to roll that directly into a phase 2. Different from that is a direct to phase 2. So this is where there's essentially a product and a company are proposing to skip phase 1. This might be under a circumstance where feasibility is already established. As a reviewer, we would see these from time to time from a company who maybe had a technology that they had developed for one product already, and they were going to use that same technology for a different product. So they said, look, feasibility has already been established in one product. We're just doing the product development for a new product based on the same feasibility. Let us jump directly to a phase 2 proposal. So graphically, this is what it looks like, a phase 1 and phase 2 proposal leading to 2B, which leads to commercialization. Fast track being the combination of the phase 1 and 2, or skipping the phase 1, going direct to phase 2, which then can lead to the pathway to commercialization. And of course, as the funding cap increases from a phase 1 to a phase 2 to a phase 2B, the competition also increases. And the number of phase 1 proposals that's funded is much greater than those phase 2 proposals, and that's much greater than the phase 2B proposals. And of course, success, as I said earlier, at phase 1 makes a company very competitive for phase 2. Likewise, success at phase 2 makes a company very competitive for a phase 2B proposal. How do you demonstrate the success? Well, in a phase 2 proposal, if you've been awarded a phase 1, you have to talk about what the milestones and specific aims were in the phase 1 proposal and how you achieved those. Likewise, for phase 2B, you have to talk about what you did in the phase 2 proposal. Okay, so how to prepare a competitive proposal? What should the tone of the proposal be? And I think it's very important that anybody putting together one of these proposals really understand who is reading and evaluating the grant on the other end. And this typically, that study section, that room full of 30 people or so, will be comprised, at least for NIH, of scientists, engineers, and some clinicians. In my opinion, there's usually fewer clinicians than I would hope, because we'd really like the clinical perspective if we're talking about something that will be used in clinical practice. But typically scientists and engineers. It's oftentimes a combination of individuals from academics and industry. Typically in industry, that'll be from larger companies. People who have high-level R&D positions might sit on these study sections. And these will be coming from universities, companies, and hospitals. And so typically it's a pretty diverse group. And so, of course, with that diversity, if you look at what is the expert of these reviewers, the answer is it's very diverse. There could be experts, people who have expertise in the domain of your exact proposal or not. And I think that's one of the key things here when putting together a proposal is to assume that some of the reviewers have no knowledge, no experience whatsoever in the domain of your proposal, and others are world-leading experts. And so the burden that an investigator has or a startup has in preparing an SBIR or STTR proposal is to write a grant that educates those who are lacking the expertise, but also impresses those who have the expertise. Impress those with expertise that you have the expertise and know exactly what you're doing. And so it's a burden, and I think that it's very important to not assume that your reviewers have expertise in your area. NIH does whatever they can to try to make sure there are people in the study section with expertise, but that doesn't always happen specifically in every domain. All right, so how do you impress the reviewers? This sounds silly, but I think one of the most important things is to remember that the reviewers are humans, and making the grant readable and understandable is really important. And when I've been a reviewer, get anywhere from 7 or 8 to 12 to 15 grant proposals to review. And when I flipped open grant proposals and it's like 20 pages of a single paragraph narrative with a half-inch margin all the way around, I mean, those are not easy to get through. It's just painful. So, by being an exception to that and making the proposal easy to read and pleasant, that immediately sets the tone for the reviewer and makes them certainly more favorable to a positive review. I think it's really important to use images. The old adage that images are worth 1,000 words. I think that that's absolutely true and can really be used to emphasize a lot of information and condense the length of a proposal. But having overly complex or cluttered images is ridiculous. Take this image that's here just as an example. Something like this. I look at this. If I'm a reviewer and I'm trying to get through a proposal quickly, I'm not going to understand something complex like this. And so I think it's very important to make sure that the images, there are images that are there, but they're easy to understand. Doing simple things like using subheadings and dividing up the proposal makes it, number one, much easier to read in the first place. It also makes it much easier when a reviewer is going back and looking for specific information, or when the reviewer is presenting that proposal to the study section. Those subheadings and dividing up the proposal can make it much easier to read, much easier to find things. Likewise, using bold and underline and italics. Again, these might sound very mundane, but it makes a huge difference in emphasizing different points, important points that a reviewer might want to go back to later on. So instead of having them go and hunt for it, if you can bold and underline these things, that can help them immensely. One thing that is incredibly important is proofreading. I mean, typos, demonstrate a total lack of attention to detail. And yes, that's an intentional typo on my part, just to emphasize the point. But, I've had reviewers get up and say, you know what, I don't think we should fund this. There were so many typos in here. I don't think the investigative team pays enough attention to detail, and I'm worried about what will happen if we actually fund them. So, going through and correcting those spelling errors and the typos. I've had proposals that refer to figures that don't exist, that refer to sections in grant proposals that don't exist. So going through one final time after the proposal is put together and making sure that there's no typos can be very important. And one other thing, this is becoming less and less important, but make sure the grant looks good in grayscale. Putting figures in that have a lot of subtle colors and everything like that can be great if someone is looking at a PDF. But there are still people that print out the grant proposals, bring them to the meeting when it's in person, or maybe are reviewing them on the airplane while they're flying to Washington. And so making sure that things look good in grayscale can actually be important. It might take a little bit of extra time to make those figures look good, but it can be important to a couple of reviewers. All right. One other thing that's important, or a couple of other things that are important, is that don't assume that the reviewers will read the grant by section in the order that you intend. Oftentimes, the way that sections are uploaded is actually different than the way the grant will end up assembled. And one of the things that's really annoying is when you flip open a grant proposal, you're reading the first section, and there's all kinds of acronyms that aren't defined in there. And those acronyms turn out to be not defined until a later section in the proposal. So my recommendation is that because the sections can get moved around, that each section should be sufficient and clear, as a standalone. All right, there might be a little bit of redundancy in there, but I think that's important. Absolutely include every section that is required of the proposal. And again, you might say, okay, that's super obvious, but there's actually some subtleties here. Reviewers have to report on all requirements. And so I would say don't leave any reviewer guessing, looking for a particular section. If a section is missing, it's an easy way for a reviewer to ding an application. And what I mean by that is, for example, reviewers have to report on human protection, which is relevant if there's a clinical trial involved in the proposal that's part of a study that involves humans. Reviewers have to report on that. If the proposal doesn't have that section, okay, it probably will be assumed that there's no clinical trial, but the reviewers have to report. So make it easy and include every section and put notes like, if a section is not applicable for your proposal, include the section and just state explicitly it's not applicable. So things like humans, use of animal research, sex is a biologic variable, meaning do you choose all females, all males, or a combination of both? Reviewers have to report on, is there a foreign component to the grant proposal? So just by putting those sections in and saying they are not applicable, you're making the job much easier for the reviewer. All right. And I think finally, one thing that's really important here is to remember that just putting together a good proposal is not good enough. This is absolutely a competition. And sometimes there might be hundreds of proposals that are received, or maybe 100 proposals that are received, and 8 or 10 of them are going to get funded at most. And so putting this together, if the attitude is, oh, this is good enough, it's sufficient, I wouldn't bother wasting the time doing it. It is a fight. And those who really take it seriously and put their best foot forward are the ones who will win these. All right, I want to talk for a minute about how reviewers specifically evaluate this, and then we'll go step by step through the sections with some guidelines and finish up. So the way that reviewers evaluate this, again, this is current from NIH. These things might change periodically. But this is basically what the worksheet is, the template that a reviewer gets when they are evaluating a proposal. So they get, today it's a PDF of the proposal, and they get this template. And so what they're looking for, and I'll talk more about each of these sections independently, is the overall impact. And that is a composite score that basically is their overall impression of the grant proposal. And then they're looking at the individual criteria of the significance of the proposal. And you'll notice here that reviewers need to comment on both the strengths and the weaknesses, right? And so it can be a great advantage for an author of a proposal to point out very explicitly, here is the significance of it, because then reviewers can copy and paste those directly into this template. Again, you're making things easier for the reviewer, right? They review the investigators, the team itself that's been assembled to actually execute the grant. What are their strengths and weaknesses? Likewise, with significance is innovation. Reviewers need to actually comment on the strengths and weaknesses of the innovation. Remember, SBIR, the I stands for innovation. If there's no innovation here, this is not going to be competitive as a grant proposal, all right? And then the approach. Approach is effectively the methods that are used. What are the techniques and the methods? How is the work going to actually be done? What are the strengths and weaknesses? And then the other individual criteria is the environment, the resources and facilities that are available to the investigator or the investigative team in order to actually get the work done. What are the strengths and weaknesses? So those each get individual scores. And then there's all these additional review criteria, from timelines to the specific criteria for a phase 2 award, which includes that commercialization plan. And then again, for fast track, there are some additional requirements, including that commercialization plan as well. And then again, reviewers have to comment on human subjects. The middle one is also related to human subjects if there is a clinical trial going on, vertebrate animals, if there's animal models, animal research, animal experiments going on. If this is what's typical is a revision. If this is a revision, the reviewers have to comment on, for example, did the investigators respond to the comments that the reviewers had in the first round? And the way that the investigators respond to this is in what's called an introduction, which is basically a cover letter. And in the cover letter, it says, hey, we responded to the following comments in the following ways. And typically they would say, okay, the things that we've changed and updated are shown in blue or have a line in the margin or something like that, so that when the reviewer is reading the revision, they know what changes were made, and they have to comment on whether the investigators were responsive to the previous reviewer's comments or not. All right. There's a section on select agents. That means things that might be dangerous, typically chemicals or biologics that would be dangerous if they were to get out into the public. Resource sharing plans. So what a resource sharing plan is for a lot of different proposals that might end up resulting in some new data that are collected because the federal government is paying for the experiments. The federal government wants that data to be accessible publicly. So how will those resources, that data, for example, be shared publicly? All right, and then there's sections on authentication of key biological or chemical resources. Again, this can be anything that might be very specific, whether it's cells, whether it's an animal model, whether it's a particular chemical or material that may be difficult to get to those. How are those going to be authenticated? And then finally, reviewers also review the budget and the duration of the grant and make comments on that. So these are all sections that the reviewers have to review. So it's very important that all of these are included in the proposal. A reviewer can choose which each of these sections to emphasize strengths or weaknesses. And in my experience, the reviewer's mind is often made up after reading just 2 sections of the grant. The summary, which generally comes first, and the specific aims, which is a 1-page section that really lays out in summary what the entire grant is about. And generally what's happening is that reviewers are reading the summary and the specific aims. They almost make a decision in their mind at that point, do I like this or not like it? And then they're using the rest of the proposal to either emphasize the strengths or the weaknesses. And so my absolute expert tip here is to make these 2 sections in particular, the summary and the specific aims, absolutely clear concise, and compelling. Make them nothing short of spectacular, because that is oftentimes where the big decision is made. All right, so let's talk about each of those individual sections, a couple of tips that I have for each section individually. So for the overall impact, again, this is a composite overall score based on the reviewer's opinion of the likelihood of success of the grant as written. All right, can the work be achieved by the people proposing it with the resources available? All right, if the work is conducted as proposed, will it achieve the goals or the impact as stated? So it's sort of the whole gestalt. It's sort of the whole overall feeling. Do I feel like this grant can make it? If it does make it, will it have an impact? You know, are there major weaknesses in it, or do I feel like you know, it has a shot? All right. This is obviously a very important metric, right? The overall impact in a first round submission, not only does it determine whether the grant is going to get funded or not, but in fact, it determines whether the grant gets discussed by the entire committee or gets thrown into a category called not discussed. And what I mean by that is that a study section can't review as an entire committee every single proposal that comes in. So what happens is that every proposal that comes in is typically assigned to 3 different reviewers: primary, secondary, and tertiary reviewer. Those 3 reviewers read and review those proposals, and they give them an initial score. And based on their initial score of overall impact, that sort of determines whether that proposal will get discussed by the full committee or not. Generally, proposals that are in the top third, maybe the top half of those preliminary scores, will get discussed by the entire committee. Those that are in the bottom 2/3 or bottom half will not get discussed by the entire committee. Why is that important? Well, it's very important in a first round submission, because if it's not discussed by the entire committee, the investigators are only getting feedback from the 3 reviewers who reviewed it. And there may be other opinions, other thoughts, other concerns that the rest of the committee would bring up, the rest of the study section would bring up. But those aren't going to be known after that first round submission. If that overall impact score is high enough, even if the proposal doesn't get funded, as long as it's discussed by the entire study section, then at least all the feedback from the entire study section should be there to help guide what should happen in a revision. So in a second round submission to revision, effectively, this number, the overall impact, determines whether this is going to get funded or not funded. So obviously, the higher the score, the better, but it's very important, not just for getting scored, but also, especially in a first round submission, does it get discussed or not discussed? And so one other tip is that a poor overall impact score on a first round submission, I say, does not mean that the work is doomed, right? Because you can get a poor overall impact score because there was something in the methods or the techniques that you proposed that a reviewer really thought was way off base. If you go and correct that, that can actually dramatically change this overall impact score. So a poor overall impact score in the first round submission does not mean the work is doomed. It means it means that with a good revision, it could be fixable. Okay, let's talk about the significance, the second section that gets its independent score. So in the significance, the reviewers will be asking, what is the importance of the proposed work, and will it significantly advance the field? Questions like, is this really worth doing? How big of a problem is it? How many patients does it affect? What is the cost associated with it? Meaning, how big of a burden is this to our healthcare system? And where exactly is the need? These are the types of things that demonstrate significance of the work, significance of the proposed solution to this problem. So it's very important that the proposal convince the reviewer through a review of the literature, going through and putting together all of this information that suggests how big of a problem it is and summarizing that in a narrative. And I would recommend, highly recommend, that in the proposal explicitly stating the words, the significance of this work is, and having that bolded and underlined and highlighted, because again, that immediately draws the reviewer's attention to that. And when they're going for their summary and to present this to the study section, they can very easily say, well, the significance of the work is this, right? You're doing their job for them. I think that not only pulling this information from the literature, but also having a testimonial from a clinical collaborator or a consultant or someone in the form of a letter of support can be really important, especially if the principal investigators are not clinicians. Getting a letter that says, hey, these guys are really working on a very important problem. It's something that I see in my clinic every single day and there's no good solution for it. That actually carries a lot of weight. Now, the score for significance is independent of whether the reviewer thinks that the work can be done as proposed or not. In other words, they're just evaluating, do we think that this is a problem worth solving or not? Forget about the whole rest of the proposal. Is this worth solving or not? And although I hate to say this, I do think that a poor significance score on a first round submission does suggest that the work is doomed. It means that the reviewers do not think this has significance. Even if successful, it will not have a high impact. And so my suggestion, if the significance score is really poor on the first round, is to completely abandon the proposal. Don't waste your time on a revision, or to completely refocus this. It's really hard to just make a revision and convince a reviewer that something is significant when they initially think that it's not significant. Okay, for a phase 2 proposal, a commercialization plan is also a requirement. And this is basically the startup's way of saying, this is how we're going to take this technology and we're going to bring it all the way through to market. How are we going to do this? And so there's several elements that I think can be killers if they're not included. So I'm going to list several of them, 6 of them that I think are very important here. One is intellectual property. Does the company have intellectual property? Have they filed for intellectual property? If it's not issued yet, patents are not issued yet, have they been filed? Are they filed in the United States? Are they filed through the international system, the CPT, international patents application process? If they have been applied for, or if they've been issued, who actually owns those patents? Is it the company? If the company was spun off from another organization, a university, a hospital, a larger corporation, who actually owns the rights to those patents? If the patents have not been issued yet, if they're pending, including a patentability opinion from a law firm can actually be very powerful. It shows the reviewers that there is a high likelihood, perhaps, based on the opinion of an attorney, that the patent application will get issued. Separate from patentability is freedom to operate. If the technology goes forward and goes all the way to market, can the technology be used without infringing on somebody else's patent? All right, so patentability and freedom to operate, 2 different things that help add value to a product or technology and allow it to go to market. What about the regulatory pathway? Is this defined? Is there a well-defined regulatory pathway? Has there been any correspondence, any communication with the FDA or whoever the appropriate regulatory body is? Is this, in fact, is the technology a medical device, or is it a consumer good? Are regulatory advisors identified? Have they been working with the startup? And if the answer to that is yes, having a letter of support from the regulatory advisors becomes really important. It's very easy for someone in a proposal to say, yeah, we're working with XYZ regulatory consultants. It's another thing to actually have a letter, some tangible evidence of that gets included with the proposals. What about pricing and reimbursement? Has the startup gone out and looked at what the cost of comparables is, looked at what the cost of existing technologies are? Are there CPT codes that would allow a hospital or a clinic to get reimbursed if they were to use the new product? If the answer to that is no, that needs to be very explicitly addressed what the strategy for reimbursement is. Does the new technology add costs to the current standard of care, or does it reduce costs? If it adds costs, what's the justification for that? If it reduces costs, that should be explicitly stated, and that's very strong to help the proposal move forward. Manufacturing, very important as well. Has the small company, has the startup thought about how they will manufacture and scale up? What is the actual cost of goods relative to the sales price? What are the margins associated with that? is the startup going to manufacture the goods themselves, or are they going to work with other vendors, suppliers, or OEMs to do so? If the manufacturer is going to work with other vendors, suppliers, or OEMs, again, having a letter from one of them saying, yes, we can make this, we're happy to work with a small company to do this, that can be very, very powerful for convincing a reviewer that the startup has thought about this step in the process. Marketing strategy and penetration. Who are the end users? Who is going to be the ones that the device is marketed to, or the technology is marketed to? What is the best way to approach those end users? And what kind of market penetration is the company anticipating? And I mean, I've seen proposals that suggested that within a year or two that they would have 50% market penetration. That's ridiculous. You know, I think it's much more appealing to a reviewer to see a company being very realistic and starting off very modestly and showing small gains that look realistic and saying over time we will become very profitable here. If the startup is going to work with a commercial partner, perhaps licensing or to sell the technology, again, a letter from that commercial partner doesn't even need to be a commitment, but say, you know, even saying something like, we've been in discussions with the small company, with the startup, that can be very powerful for legitimizing what the small company is saying that they're going to do. And I think finally, you know, exit strategy. I mean, this is something that a lot of proposals are missing. You know, what is the exit strategy for the small company? Is the hope that they're going to scale up and compete with the whatever, the Medtronics and Johnson & Johnsons of the world? Are they going to license or sell the technology? What is the exit strategy? Even if it's a few sentences, a paragraph or two about what the company's exit strategy is in the long term, just showing that the startup has put some thought into this is really important. And again, my tip here is to include all of these elements, even if they are not thought out in every single detail, even if they're immature, but just shows the reviewers that the investigators are thinking about it, even if they don't have all the answers to it. And I think that's very important. All right, another criteria that the reviewers are looking for is innovation. Is there true innovation here? What is really unique and different and novel compared to the standard of care? If there is true innovation, that's fantastic. And again, I think this should be pointed out in the proposal that the innovation of the proposed solution is, and it's stated there, this makes it very easy for the reviewer. Or is this really just an incremental improvement? And if that is the case, this is not likely to be a grant where that's innovation is going to get a good score and ultimately will be competitive. So innovation, that element must be there. And again, as I said, in the proposal explicitly stating the innovation of the proposed solution is this, and then the reviewer can just copy and paste that right out of the proposal into their review. And I think that the important thing here is to really convince the reviewer through benchmarking, you know, what else is currently out there and why is this better and innovative? I think that's very important. A testimonial, again, from a clinical collaborator saying, I think this idea that the small company has come up with is fantastic compared to what we're using. Having that in a letter of support can be very valuable. And of course, having patents or patent applications to demonstrate where the actual novelty and innovation is can help to really reinforce this argument of innovation. You know, again, one tip here is that if the startup has any preliminary data, which is not required for a phase 1. It is required for a phase 2. It's not required for a phase 1. But if you have any preliminary data that shows something unique or interesting or unexpected or superior about the startup's innovation compared to what's out there, that can really help to suggest innovation. And so I would suggest having a section in the innovation, larger section, that actually is preliminary data if the startup actually has any for it. This can be very, very powerful. All right, so what about the approach? This is the section where basically it is described in detail exactly what methods are going to be used to solve the problem, to actually establish the feasibility or to move through the product development process. And one thing immediately that I want to say that I think is very important for a startup is to avoid, as part of a grant proposal, an SBIR grant, is to say that as part of the work we're going to do, we're going to define the problem, or we're going to define what the user needs are. this should definitely not be part of the approach. This should be done before the grant and included in the significance section or included in the background section or in multiple places. Grant proposals where one of the specific aims is to define the problem is a complete miss, because if you don't already know what the problem is, how do you know how to approach it? How do you know what your technology or solution is? And yet see grant proposals that include this over and over again. Again, those specific aims, that one page that really lays out everything in an explicit summary, so important. As I said before, most reviewers will have a really good idea of whether they want the proposal to get funded or not just after reading that one specific aims page. These specific aims have to be really well-defined, really explicit, really quantitative, not qualitative, not nebulous. Avoid things like, we will explore a particular topic, or we will evaluate in very nebulous terms doing something. That is absolutely ridiculous, because how does the reviewer know whether you're going to achieve that or not if you don't put explicit details of what you're going to do in there? Each specific aim should absolutely have explicit details and should have metrics for success versus failure, and should indicate what the expected outcome is. If you say, in a particular specific aim that we're going to do this testing and look for a result, what does that result mean? What is good? What is bad? What is above a threshold or below a threshold? What suggests that this technology will be able to meet the future milestones or not? So including metrics for success or outcomes becomes very important for convincing the reviewer that the approach is sound. So having statements like, we will measure something using the established technique of something with success defined by something. Statements like that, where it's explicit, is really important in the specific aims. I would encourage, if any quantitative data is going to be collected, don't forget to include the techniques that will be used for data analysis and statistical analysis. And this is something, again, it's very easy for a reviewer to ding a proposal and say, oh, they didn't talk about how they're going to analyze the data, what statistics they were going to use to compare different treatments or something like that. And along with statistics, including a sample size calculation. If you say, okay, we're going to do these experiments and we're going to do the experiments on, some number of samples, where did that number come from? Is it enough? Is it too many? Again, these are things that are very easy for a reviewer to be critical of. And I think in the approach section, this is also a great place to include preliminary data. Even if the preliminary data isn't specifically relevant to the technology that's in the grant, if it demonstrates experience with the experimental techniques, that very much helps the reviewers helps to convince the reviewers that the team will be successful in doing the approach. And one thing that I'll add here is a real sort of advanced tip is in the approach section, including statements about or subsections on pitfalls and alternatives for every specific aim is really critical. Basically, what that says is, okay, here's what we're proposing to do for the specific aim. Here's the model that we're going to use. Here's the experimental techniques that we're going to use. Here's the number of samples that we're going to use. And here's how we're going to analyze the data and what our metrics for success are. However, it is possible that something might not go exactly as planned. And these are potential pitfalls and the alternatives that we will use if we happen to fall into one of these pitfalls. Just having a couple of sentences for that, talking about maybe where there's a couple of higher risk items and how the company will get past those, that can become very important. And it shows the reviewers that you're anticipating challenges and know how to get around them. All right, the investigators. Again, this is something that the reviewers are going to be looking for. One of the places to justify the investigators is actually in a section called the budget justification. In the budget justification, there's an opportunity to indicate the explicit role of each investigator and to indicate their relative experience that they have and their ability to achieve what their job is with respect to the grant. It's also an opportunity in the budget justification to focus on the PI's leadership ability in the short description around the PI. And it's also a very important place to indicate that each investigator will put a reasonable amount of time into the proposal. What reviewers don't want to see is a principal investigator who's going to be putting in 2% of their time over the grant period. That's not enough. They also don't want to see a principal investigator that's going to put, 2/3, 67% of their time. That's way too much. Nobody's going to spend that many hours in a week, every week, week after week, working on a phase 1 SBIR, for example. So putting in a reasonable time allocation for all the investigators becomes very important. Within these grant proposals, there has to be a biosketch for every investigator. Putting the biosketches into the correct format can be very important, because then reviewers can very quickly go through and just check all the elements. Within the NIH biosketch format, there is what's called a personal statement. And the personal statement is really just a narrative saying, this is who I am, and this is what I can do. And I think what's very important and really sends a message to the reviewers is if those personal statements are specific to the proposal, not just saying, hey, I'm a good engineer or scientist, but saying my expertise specifically lends me to contributing to this particular proposal, this particular project, this technology. It's very personalized. If there is a history of collaboration between the co-investigator and the principal investigator, or consultants or collaborators, I think that's very important to highlight, because that suggests that the team has experience working together and can be successful. And then finally, letters of support. Letters of support, again, this goes beyond just the narrative of saying, hey, we're working together, but having letters of support from each collaborator or consultant that's outside of the organization really suggests to the reviewers that this is a well-formed proposal, and that the group can work well together. And these should be personalized and on letterhead. And again, as a tip, I would include consultants liberally. Including a consultant as a statistician, including a regulatory consultant, a patent consultant, a legal consultant. It doesn't really cost the company to anything to get these consultants on board, other than making a few phone calls and getting a letter from them, but it can help to eliminate some of the concerns that a reviewer might have. And again, I would ask early to get these letters from these consultants. All right, and finally, on these individual criteria, the environment. What reviewers are looking for here is, do the investigators have the facilities and resources available to them to get the work done? And so I think it's very important in a proposal to describe all of the accessible facilities, including those of the contractors or OEMs. So for example, if a device is going to be made by an OEM, describing all of the resources and facilities that OEM has available to them can really add a lot of power and value to the proposal. Again, if the facilities are going to be outside of the small company, including letters of support from those OEMs, from those manufacturers or whatever, can also be very powerful. Confirming access to all key pieces of equipment. I remember reviewing a proposal that was all about a new piece of technology for enhancing ultrasound, and nowhere in the proposal did they say that they actually had access to an ultrasound machine. So confirming access to all these key pieces of equipment is really important, and confirming access to all non-commercially available materials, including special chemicals, biologics, animal models, patients, et cetera. These can be very important. And one thing that I would not do is just to put a huge long list of non-relevant equipment into the facilities and resources. That really can annoy the reviewers when they're looking for these more relevant things. And one thing to definitely include would be access to key software, CAD and modeling software, statistical software, things like that can be absolutely key. All right, finally, the very last topic here, just a couple of notes on things to look for or to include in the budgets that reviewers would look for. And I think, again, although this is very obvious, I'll say it, include every associated cost in the budget. Typically when I'm preparing a grant, I will finish the narrative in the grant, and then I'll sort of go through every step of the approach and look at what costs there are with those steps and make sure that there's a line item that corresponds in the budget to that. If there's something that's missing, the reviewers will find it and they will flag it. Getting quotes from suppliers and contractors and consultants is really important, not just putting estimates into the budget, and including those quotes or letters from those contractors or consultants in the proposal. Again, it shows that the small company has done their due diligence. The salary for the investigator should be a small proportion of the funds. A $250,000 grant where $200,000 is going to investigator salary is a real turnoff to a reviewer. The percent effort for the key people should be very reasonable. Again, I said that already, not 2% and not 75%, but a very reasonable, amount. How much time will they actually spend week to week, working on this? And cost sharing is okay. In other words, you can say, well, this person is going to put 10% of their time into the grant proposal, but we're only going to charge 5% of their time into the grant. And the rest of the money is going to come from the company, from some other source. It's okay to put that in there. And all roles should be listed in the budget, even if no funding is allocated to them. So if you have a statistician and they're doing it, for free, not charging you, that should be listed in the budget. Excuse me, even if the number of funds that are requested is 0. And if the total budget for the whole study, excuse me, if the total budget for the whole study goes above and beyond what the limits are for that grant, then talking about where other funds will come in to supplement that can be very important in the budget as well. All right. So also SBIRs, and again, this varies a little bit from institute to institute, but they allow a company to include indirect costs, which means that basically you can just add about 20% or so off the top onto the total grant amount and not have to justify other than saying that it's indirect costs, and also allows for a fee, about 7% or so, to be recovered. And these don't really require any justification other than saying we're putting indirect cost of 20% and a fee of 7%. And it's a way for the small company to get some extra funds in to help support the research and facilities and things like that. All right, so to summarize, just a couple of points that I think are important. Number one is to start early. Just the registration process alone can take 6 to 10 weeks. And again, there's only 3 cycles per year for NIH, so missing a cycle can be a real killer on the timing. Second is to find the right study section, doing some due diligence ahead of time and contacting that scientific review officer to go through the process, the timing, and making sure that the study section is a good fit. Soliciting letters of support very early, again, several weeks ahead of time. Those letters of support can be really critical to adding to the validity of a particular submission of a proposal itself. And I can't overemphasize this enough, composing an easy to read proposal that's really clear and really, putting at the forefront consideration of the reviewers who are human beings and have to get through many proposals in detail. Again, I know it seems obvious, but including all those required elements, even those which are not applicable, is really important. And I'll just say one more time that I think that the summary and specific aim sections are absolutely key to the being successful here. And remember, this is a competition, and if for free money, and if you're going to do it, I suggest that you do it and enter to win, not just to compete, but absolutely to win. So hopefully this was helpful for you. I'd like to thank Leading Entrepreneurs of the World for inviting me to talk on this topic. I'd like to thank my present employers and my past employers and all my colleagues and collaborators who have helped me to move forward in my career. And with that, I'll end. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eric. Very much appreciated. Wow, what an involved process. I tell you, some tremendous tips without a doubt. Had a little bit of experience. So, I mean, your tips are kind of universal, at least based on some of my own experience. I mean, I've been involved in a number of not-for-profits on the boards over the course of my career, and I know we've applied for different types of grants from different granting agencies. And what you said about going through the entire process, even if you don't get it, it's really a great self-reflecting tool. When you come back, and for an entrepreneur from a startup standpoint, it's really forcing you to think about really, start to finish, right? Soup to nuts on all of what may or may not happen, and how are you going to succeed, especially focusing on the commercialization side of it. So I thought, again, I've gone through that. Even in cases where we didn't get the grant, we learned so much about ourselves that we actually embedded that then into our strategic planning process, the type of feedback we got from the different agencies and things like that. So that's really valuable. I got a smile about this specific aim section. It made me think back to when I worked at the New York Stock Exchange. and my boss, Kathy, used to say, Glenn, why do I have to read your entire report to get to your recommendation? Tell me up front, tell me up front what I'm supposed to be focusing on and looking at. And it's interesting because, right, you know, kind of you think of the movie Jerry Maguire. You had me at hello, right?
Yeah.
If you get them up front and you get them comfortable and they're kind of on your side going into the deep dive, then they're looking at ways to kind of support their initial feeling, right?
That's exactly right. Yeah.
And that certainly bodes well for the company. Couple straight questions. The scientific review officer, the SRO, how often do those rotate in and out? I mean, is that like a tenured position? Is it forever? If you applied once and you maybe got an unfavorable outcome, does that person ever swap out and you may have a second bite at the apple with a new set of eyes?
Yeah, so the SROs, they do not have a direct role in the review other than that they are a facilitator.
Okay.
So they'll make sure that all the processes are performed, are conducted the way that they're supposed to. They will answer questions sort of about procedure and policy along the way that the study section might have. There are there are heads of study sections. Those are people who are peers. They're, you know, this is a peer review process, so they are peers. They have some special training. And they are the ones that lead the review process and they participate in the review process. If everything goes as planned, the SRO's role really ends when the reviews start. And they will just make sure that the process, that, you know, the right proposals are reviewed in the right order, that everything is discussed that's supposed to be discussed, but they don't participate in the opinion part, in the actual evaluation and review. Some SROs are a little bit more involved and I would say are more helpful in my experience than others, but they're not even so much an advocate for the company, you know, one way or the other, but they're really there to help with the process and to make sure that the companies can, you know, do everything that they need to do and that the study sections do everything that they need to do. I've worked with some SROs that have been around for probably decades. Maybe they've had a couple of moves, but just, you know, within decades, and others who seems like every time the study section meets, it's a new SRO. So it, you know, it's highly variable in that regard.
That sounds very much like an air traffic controller in a way.
Yeah. Yep. Exactly.
Assuming you're successful, how does the funding work? Is it lump sum? Is it like a line of credit?
So the way that the funding works is that then there are requests that are put in. The requests are usually for tranches. You know, we need $25,000 to start. We need another 10,000. We need 50,000. You know, whatever. And there is some accounting. You know, there are some restrictions as to what the funds can be used for, how they can be moved around. That also depends. You know, varies a little bit from institute to institute. But generally, as long as the startup has a checking account, you know, a bank account that the money can be transferred to, upon request, certain amounts of money, you know, are just moved to the account and then can be spent down by the company that way.
I also found interesting on your making sure all the sections are filled out. I've participated in a number of pretty large requests for proposals, and sometimes that becomes part of the reason. You're giving them a reason to bounce you out, right? Oh, well, they left out section 7, you know, little I, or whatever like that. So always very specific to be as you know, as complete as you can.
Yeah,
I guess it strikes me as it's as you said, it's you're not giving up equity. It's an opportunity to really frame your story, go through it, and potentially seek, you know, grant money here. And it's really a great self-discovery opportunity, I think, for companies if they're able to go through this. Recognizing, again, and I also like that you said be realistic about having pitfalls and alternatives in there. I think that's often critical as well, because people sometimes come in, of course this is going to work, right?
Yeah.
Or it's going to be this pie in the sky type of thing, and then the first pushback you get, if they're not ready for it, you know, it could be one of those types of body blows. You put up that picture of the big room. I've been to a bunch of DC meetings in my lifetime, more on the capital market side, but it kind of works the same way. That big square, all of the people around the table as you go through it, and a lot of kind of what you described a little bit is similar to how the public markets work when you submit your your prospectus if you're going to go public, and the SEC comments on it. And you get that series of comment letters, and you have to kind of go back and making sure that you've always answered it right. And how did you answer it right? Not just ignoring it, and that's the key to a review. And I've seen plenty of those types of comment letters, like where you'll get back the letter and it's like, well, you didn't really answer our question,
Yeah.
or our first point.
You know, it's amazing. It was an amazing experience for me, and I highly recommend it to anyone to be a reviewer, because in a very short period, you know, a few weeks period during the review and then the study section, you get to really see a whole spectrum of really awful proposals that will never get funded to really spectacular ones. And I think that as an investigator myself, the more reviews that I did, the better I got at putting together, you know, decent proposals. And, you know, there's a whole spectrum of them. And so I think it definitely takes some practice. And, you know, hopefully the tips that I included here, you know, can be of some use, and hopefully cut out some cycles and some rejections that some startups get.
Absolutely. And maybe they get lucky, they get one of those spring ahead type of opportunities as they go through. It's interesting. I do have what you said about the application process. I'm part of another not-for-profit piece, and I got to probably read 135 award applications over the next 2 weeks. So I'm going to use a lot of your tips here as I go through these essays from these various organizations saying, please pick us. So it's all very good. Well, listen, Eric, great to be with you again. You are clearly an expert. You're an entrepreneur. You're such a success. Thank you for your time. Thank you for the completeness of the talk and the review. What's the best way for people to get in touch with you if they want to?
I think the best way to get in touch with me is through the website with my current organization, Center for Disability Services, and we're in New York, so it's cfdsny.org. And then the Health Innovations Incubator is a separate link, you know, off of that site. So you can get a hold of me that way. Email and contact information is on that website.
All right, very good. All right, Eric, nice seeing you again. Thank you for joining us again today. Incredible presentation as always. Wish you all the best in the future.
Thank you, Glenn. My pleasure. And thanks for the opportunity to work with leading entrepreneurs of the world.
Very good. Take good care. Thank you.